Welcome to this evening's live presentation of Ask UAS. Ask UAS, where Ketchikan finds answers. Ask UAS is a lecture, presentation, and community interest series presented by the UAS Ketchikan Campus Library. Stay tuned at the end of the presentation to hear how you can find previous Ask UAS sessions online and how to stay updated on our coming events. For our lecture this evening, we have Writer's Block, Why We Get Hung Up When Writing Everything from Emails to Novels, presented by Professor Stephen Florian. Professor Florian is the UAS Ketchikan's Assistant Professor of Writing and Communication. Professor Florian originally hails from California, where he taught composition, business, writing, and academic first-year experience classes at California State University Northridge for 5 years. He also received his MA in Rhetoric and Composition from CSUN. He has also taught composition and critical thinking at Los Angeles Valley College and New York Film Academy. Professor Florian's areas of research is retention and persistence among college students. He is currently working on a dissertation in that field through the Composition and Applied Linguistics PhD program at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He has presented papers at academic conferences across the United States and in Australia on such diverse topics as protest rhetoric, the rhetoric of surfing, and the commerce of virtue in Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews. So we would like to, just as a preliminary note, let you know that we are broadcasting live today. Professor Florian is in the Ketchikan UAS campus library right now. And because this event is being broadcast live, we would encourage you to go ahead and put your questions and any relevant comments that you'd like feedback on in the chat box. One of our staff is on hand who will read your questions to Professor Florian, either in line for his presentation if it's appropriate, or after the main portion of his presentation is concluded, so that he can respond to you live on video through Facebook Live. So I would just like to go ahead again and say thank you, Professor Florian, for sharing your time with us today. And please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. First of all, I want to thank Michelle Lambton and Kathy Bowling for setting up this talk. I'm happy to be here. When they asked me to do an Ask UAS, they said, what would you like to do an Ask UAS about? And I said, I don't know. And we came up with this idea about writer's block. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And so I went home to my wife and I said, hey, I'm going to do an Ask UAS about writer's block. And she said, what are you going to talk about? And I said, I don't know. And she said, it sounds like you might have writer's block. I was like, maybe. And the reason why we chose this topic is it's something that happens to a lot of people, but it's not something that gets talked about a lot, especially in the academic realm. And so I started doing some research on writer's block, and I didn't find much. Mike Rose wrote a really interesting book in the 80s about writer's block, and he didn't have a lot to work with either when he was working on that book. And so I thought, well, maybe this is going to be more interesting than I had previously considered. So I'm going to show a few slides here, and we're just going to talk about writer's block. And so if anyone has any questions in terms of anything that's coming up on these slides, fire up the chat box, and then Kathy will let me know what your questions are, and we'll try and either answer them in real time or we'll do a little Q&A at the end, however it works out best. So let's go to our first slide here. So a couple of definitions of what writer's block is or what it could be. So I took this one from Mike Rose's book. Writer's block then can be defined as an inability to begin or continue writing for reasons other than a lack of basic skill or commitment. A more sort of generic description could be the condition of being unable to think of what to write or how to proceed in writing. So when they say the word condition in that one, it makes you, well, the first thing I thought was, sort of sounds like a disease, right? And I thought, well, that's a little harsh. But then when you are locked up in terms of your writing, it can really sort of affect you emotionally and physically, right? And it starts to compound to the point where you feel debilitated in terms of this writing task, whatever it is. So I thought, well, that's an interesting way to put it. Mike Rose's definition I like, and one of the things that I like about it is that even if you're suffering from writer's block, one of the things that it presupposes is that you're taking action and you're being stopped in some way, shape, or form. So there are a multitude of reasons why you could feel this effect of being stopped or blocked. So let's see what we come up with. Slides now. There you go. So certainly in the academic realm, you can't be a college student without writing. And I feel like I spent a lot of my semester talking people through these episodes of writer's block, whether it's for an assignment or a particular assignment, or whether it's a semester-long struggle for people to address these prompts and attack these writing assignments that I give. And so you're writing all the time in college. And so if you have writer's block, this is a anxiety ridden event for you anytime you have to write a paper of any sort. But also in your regular life, you might experience writer's block. You might have to write a promotion letter, or you get a new job and someone says to you at your job, or your boss says, write a bio about yourself and tell us all the things you've done. Well, that might cause you enough anxiety to not feel like you want to do it or can do it, maybe because you don't feel comfortable talking about yourself, right? Sometimes you're going to have to write a letter of reference, especially if you're in a management position of some sort. You might have to write a speech at a wedding. That's a pretty common one. And so some people, sort of breeze through these things, but a lot of people really feel like they're put on the spot and not sure what to say. And a lot of times maybe it's, well, what's the appropriate thing to say? It's hard to know, right? Sometimes you have to write an email. Let's say you have to write an email to your son or daughter's teacher, right? And well, that seems like an easy enough task, but there are a lot of things at stake probably in this email that you're writing. Maybe something went wrong. How do you frame it in a way that makes you seem like a concerned parent but not an overbearing parent? Well, that takes some work to really sort that out, right? And how do you address tone in an email as opposed to a phone call or an in-person conversation? That can be tough sometimes. You're never quite sure how people are going to read your writing, and so if you are thinking about your audience and your reader, this can sometimes cause a lot of anxiety, especially when the stakes are high. Here's a good example of where people might run into some writer's block at work. In general, it takes about an hour to write a one-page business letter. Now that seems like a lot of time for a one-page letter, but there are a lot of things at stake in terms of writing a business letter. One thing to consider certainly is that a one-page letter needs to be concise, right? You can't make any mistakes. If you make grammar mistakes, if you make punctuation mistakes, if your letter is not readable, it affects your credibility as a writer. You may be the smartest person in the room, but if you're not a good writer, it makes you seem less smart than you are in some way. People start to judge you. They judge your writing, and they then judge you. It's going to cause a lot of anxiety and a lot of angst, right? You got to spend a lot of time editing just to make sure you're doing everything correctly. Business letters can often function as a contract. If you're asking someone to take action or spend money, then this letter then becomes a legal document. And so you have to be very careful in terms of what you say and how you say it. You say the wrong thing and it could cost you a lot of either time or money. So these are real concerns. So one thing we can think about in terms of our writing process is, well, what is it that's hanging us up, right? So if we just sort of break it down to its smaller parts and think about the elements of writing, well, we all know how to write, right? We can form letters, we can form words, we can form sentences. We learned how to do this when we were kids, right? we don't think about it now. So, and I imagine a lot of people don't remember when they learned to read or write. Maybe some people did, but I think a lot of people don't. And so, in some ways, it feels like a very natural process. We can have conversations with people, and we can think and speak, but when we have to put it down on paper, we're then externalizing that process, that language process. Our brains, Steven Pinker wrote a really interesting book on, I think it's called Language Instinct, and he talks about how we're hardwired for language and we're hardwired for grammar. And that our brains want to automatically organize our language in a grammatical way. If you look at how little kids, when they're learning language, often they're oddly grammatically correct in the way that they say things a lot of times, pretty close. And no one's quite sure why that happens exactly, but it happens. And so it lets us know that you're hardwired for grammar. But when you have to externalize that process and think about it and construct it on paper, sometimes it gets confusing. And so people get anxious about it. And I get this a lot when the first week of class I'll ask people to write what their writing goals are. And a lot of times people will say, especially in these lower level writing classes, they're not good at grammar. They're not good at syntax and structural issues. And they worry, the biggest worry is often grammar issues. And they often say, I'm not a good writer. So you get the sense quickly that people really internalize these sort of levels of shame about their writing, and it shuts them down. And so I spend a lot of my semester trying to open them up and to get them writing, and to get them to change the way they think about how they write and who they are as writers. So what's the big problem then in terms of writer's block? Sometimes it's the person. Sometimes it's the way that you're internalizing the way you think about yourself as a writer. But sometimes the problems are external. Sometimes it's the prompt. Sometimes you'll get a writing task and you'll look at it and you'll say, well, this is unclear. I don't understand what I'm supposed to do or what this person wants me to do. I know as a teacher, I'm guilty of that sometimes. It happened to me this week. I wrote a question in a prompt which I thought was clear, and many of my students wrote back to me and said, I don't understand what this means. And so, especially in newer assignments, this happens to me, where I'll write things that are not exactly clear. I understand it, and it seems obvious to me, but it's not obvious to them. And so, these are things that cause anxiety, right? Sometimes it could be just a matter of inadequate planning on your part. Maybe you didn't take enough time to think about the task and what's required of this task. And then you start to work on this writing assignment, whatever it is, and you're pressured by inadequate planning, not enough time, and these things start to pile up. Sometimes people get hung up on editing too. Like they edit as they write, which I think is incredibly problematic. I feel like if you're going to write, you should just write and get that first draft out, whatever it is, in whatever form it comes out, and then go back and look at it and edit it, proofread it, and shape it up. Your first drafts are always going to be messy. No one ever turns in clean, crisp, beautiful first drafts. It never happens. And so, but I think there's this sort of mythology that some people are just better writers and that they're magical in terms of their writing abilities, and these sort of things don't happen to them. It's not true. And I've been reading studies lately of how what affects student persistence rates in college. And often we think about, well, struggling students, they're the ones we always got to keep an eye on. But I read some really interesting reports about students at Ivy League schools that are very high-functioning students, but they don't understand the the expectations of academic writing as a genre. And so these super smart kids find themselves struggling in these very high-functioning schools. It can be very problematic for them, right? It's just as stressful for them as it is for the people that come in unprepared in many ways. Part of the problem might be your relationship with how you write. Some people are fast typers, right, and don't make mistakes. I unfortunately am not one of those people. I make a lot of mistakes when I type. I type slow. I'm not that guy, but I do make a lot of mistakes, and it takes me a long time to write something. And even after I get the 2 or 3 drafts of it out, even emails, I have to go back and read them again and make sure I didn't make any mistakes. And if it's really important, I'll let someone else read it before I send it out. I know myself in terms of that stuff. And I also have bad handwriting. And so I prefer to type things because my handwriting is bad. And maybe I should have went to medical school instead of becoming a writing instructor because of my handwriting. But so these things can sort of block you up too, right? If you already have this sense about yourself that maybe you're not good at typing and your handwriting is not good, well, that affects your self-esteem in terms of who you feel like you are as a writer, right? And so it may make you not want to write or not want to tackle these tasks or not take a job that includes a lot of writing. So I thought, well, how do you get around things like that? And there's a couple things you could do, right? That you could find someone to edit your work. If you can come up with some sort of reciprocal agreement with someone and say, I'll read yours, you read mine, if it's a school situation, or even at work, if you know that there's someone you work with that's a really good writer, and say, hey, can you look at my stuff before I send it out? Maybe you can work out some other thing that you can do for them. That's a pretty good situation. If you don't feel comfortable typing and writing by hand, you could certainly, there's so many apps you could put on your phone to just dictate what you want to say and then transcribe it later. That's another pretty good way to get around it too. So these are things to think about in terms of, well, how do we get around this debilitating aspect of writing block and how it shuts us down? There's a lot of behaviors related to blocking. Anxiety, certainly. Frustration, certainly. Sometimes anger comes into play. That's not helpful. Confusion, I would say, happens a lot of the time. Sometimes Mike Rose talks about high blocking and low blocking in this book. And in terms of high blocking, it mostly relates to this idea about high-functioning people who get blocked up. And so they may be able to start writing or get the process going. But if there are things that are problematic for them in their writing process, eventually they're going to run out of road and they're going to get stuck somewhere. Blind alleys, I think is what he referred to it as. But a lot of times these false starts can be more frustrating than not being able to write at all. And so you get to a certain point and you feel like you can't go any farther, and it feels like you've run into the terminal end of your intelligence, which is, it's not true. There's something else at work that's stopping you. We can go down this whole road of the fixed mindset, growth mindset realm to sort of address some of these issues, but really when you get into these false start situations, it's that you're running into this fixed mindset where you think that your abilities are fixed or your intelligence level is fixed, and you can't go anywhere beyond it. Well, it's not true, but it doesn't stop people from thinking. That prompt we talked about. So, if you have a pen and a piece of paper handy, I have a little writing prompt for you. You can write it on your computer. If you're watching this on your computer, pull up a little notepad or a Word document. I'm going to set a timer for 1 minute. And I I want you to write for 1 minute. You can write about whatever you want, doesn't matter. You could write the word hello over 50 times, it doesn't matter. But sit down and write for 1 minute and see what comes, okay? You don't have to share this with anybody, but I'm gonna set my timer. So, 1 minute, remarks, get set, go. All right, you got about 10 seconds. Whatever you're writing about, try and wrap it up a little bit. Okay, you can stop. Now, I'm going to give you a prompt. You have 1 minute to write, but this time I want you to write about the ocean. Write about whatever you want, as long as it relates to the ocean. Ready? 1 minute. Marks, get set, go. All right, you got about 10 seconds. Trying to wrap up whatever you're writing about. And so, you're done. Okay. Now I want you to write something in the chat box and let us know how that experience went for you. Was it easy? Was it stressful? Did you have writer's block? Did you think about something to write about? Let me know how it worked out for you. So a lot of times when we can't write, we come up with excuses for why we can't write. And again, I think this relates back to this fixed mindset, where somewhere along the line, you were either told that you were not a good writer, which I think unfortunately happens a lot. I think it happens to a lot of kids in high school, where they come to college, and I've heard this story a lot of times where some teacher of theirs just straight up told them they weren't a good writer, which I think is an incredibly problematic thing to do and to tell a high school student, because it makes them feel like their intelligence is fixed in some way, that they can't ever progress beyond this level, whatever that is. Of course, we know that's not true. Sometimes they believe that they don't have the capabilities to be a good writer. Some people will come and say, oh, I'm a math person, I'm not a writing person, or I'm a writing person, but I'm not a math person, right? So they get these ideas in their head that there's this sort of binary of either they're a numbers person or a letters person, which also is not true. You may have preferences in either direction, but your levels of intelligence are not fixed in terms of whether you're a letters or a numbers person. Some people come in and say, well, I'm just lazy. Well, that might be true. And I don't know that there's much that you can do about lazy, but it also might be that person sort of masking the way they feel about themselves as a writer. And it's easier to say that than to really sort of dig into what the actual problem is.
So Professor Florian, do you want to hear some of these
questions.
responses?
Oh, good. What do you
Well,
got?
some responses to what it was like to write for When
Okay, great.
Minute. Someone wrote, no time to think it over made it easier. Someone wrote, easy, no problems. And then another participant said, I agree with the first comment, no time to think, just do. And we had a topic given to us. Someone wrote, I didn't have a problem with it because I knew no one else would be reading it. And then someone wrote, okay, it was me. I was surprised by what came out without resistance. I don't think of myself as a writer. And then someone wrote, I wrote about surfing. I'm fixated on that right now. And they had made a comment earlier, and I wondered if possibly you know this person. She wrote, after reading some of your work, how did you develop a concept of surfing as a metaphysical experience? And was it hard to put a concept like that into a paper?
Well, in terms of surfing being a metaphysical experience, I think that's another topic for an Ask UAS.
Excellent.
Okay, that'll be a good one. I'll be ready for that. All right, we'll mark that down. Well, it's interesting that people feel like it was easy to write this because they didn't have time to think about it, which is an indication to me that the more people have, more time they have to think about the task, it can go one of two ways. Either they have plenty of time to prepare if they're an organized person and they're a disciplined writer, then probably they're not going to experience any level of blockage in terms of the writing. But if you're not used to writing, or if you're not a professional writer, or it's not part of your everyday routine, and you have a lot of time, this might work against you, that you might overthink it, or think yourself into a place where it all of a sudden becomes debilitating, and then you think that you can't do it. Well, these things can happen, right? But I feel like writing in a lot of ways is kind of like a muscle that the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. And the more you read, the better writer you're going to become. So if you say, well, I want to be a writer in whatever capacity, even if you just want to be better at writing emails to your friends or coworkers, or you want to write a novel, or you want to write a screenplay, whatever it is, the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. And when you adopt this as a practice, and then you start reading other people's writing, people that you like, you're going to see the things that they do, and you're going to start to incorporate some of those moves, rhetorical moves and strategies into your writing, and all of a sudden things are going to seem a lot more fluid. I like this quote that Mike Rose offers up. Writing is perceived as a mysterious, amorphous, emotional difficulty, not as a delimitable process that can be analyzed and remedied through instruction. So what he's saying here essentially is that it's not, writing is not a gift, it's a practice. And you can become a better writer. You got to work at it. And I don't mean work at it in like, like it's like terrible work. It's a practice that you have to take on. And you have to dedicate yourself to. And you have to give yourself time to do it. A lot of times when people talk about writer's block, it gets conflated with writing apprehension, which is different. So a lot of people suffer from writing apprehension in different degrees, different levels. But apprehension is actually a category of blockage So it would be subsumed by blockage. It's not, it doesn't function on the same level. It's more like a condition of blockage. Writing apprehension isn't always debilitating in the way that blockage can be debilitating. We use this Daily Miller writing apprehension test is an interesting test. I use it in my composition classes. We do it in the second week of class. This is all it is. It's a 20-question test. And what I like about it is that when students take this test, they can measure their levels of apprehension towards writing. What's great about this test is that it tells you that most people, when you read back the results in class, it tells you that most people suffer from some level of writing apprehension, whether large or small. What's also great about this test is that you can take this test at different times in the semester and you'll get different scores. So it also tells you then that whatever levels of apprehension you're having in terms of your writing is context related. It depends on the writing event and what's at stake in terms of that event. So maybe you don't feel great about yourself as a writer at the beginning of the semester and your score reflects that. But halfway through the semester, you're learning all sorts of new things, you're getting notes, you're getting comments on your writing, things are starting to improve. Well, if you took this test again in the middle of the semester, you'd likely get a different score. You're probably feeling better and less apprehensive about your writing. Now, if I gave you a 30-page paper that you have to write as your final assignment, well, if you took this apprehension test again before that, well, it might change again. You might feel apprehensive towards that. And then if I made you take it afterwards, after you got your scores back, well, again, you might get a different score in terms of this test, right? And so it tells you that most people have some level of apprehension, but it also is a clear indication that when you're having writing apprehension and writer's block, it's almost always context related to the event, that writing event, whatever it is. So if that's true, then that means that we can do something about it. If we can recognize it and understand this as one of the symptoms of blockage, well, then we should be able to come up with some strategies to get around it, or get past it. You know, if you have to write at work, there's no getting around it. And if you have to write in college, there's no getting around it. And so you can either suffer or you can come up with productive strategies to work your way through it, work your way around it, right? Writing, the other part of the problem, especially in terms of blockage and the way that it can feel debilitating, is writing is often a very isolated incident. And so we often think about it in these sort of isolating terms, but the reality is that writing it's a social construct. As the writer, you need an audience. If you're writing and no one else is reading it but you, well, then it's a journal for you. But if you're not writing a journal or a diary, and your writing has to go out into the world, it's a social construct, and we need our audience, right? So sometimes that can be good, and sometimes that can be bad in terms of how we're perceiving ourselves as writers. One of the things that's great about considering your audience is that it can get you through these blockages if you can create an imagined audience. Lisa Eade writes about this a lot, and it's a really sort of interesting idea that if you can think about someone who you either want to impress, or someone who doesn't think you're smart and you want to show them that you're smart, or if you're competitive with someone in some way, shape, or form, or even there's someone that you don't like and you want to write to them, if that's the thing that motivates you to get writing on this project, great. So if you can construct this imagined audience, it could be one person, it could be 5 people, it could be 10 people. And what's nice about creating, if you can label this Imagine audience and put all your people in there. You can use different people at different moments or different writing projects from your little group of imagined audience. And it's going to change the way you approach that writing project. It's certainly going to change the tone and how you're going to go about it, right? And so this is a very effective way to get unstuck. So a lot of times we think, we feel like our writing is going to be judged and we don't want to show it to other people, right? Because if someone is judging our writing, then they're judging us. We take this very personally in a lot of ways. And I don't know that you can do much about that except change your relationship to how or what you want from your audience. And one of the benefits in terms of writing or being a writer is that you get to edit your work, right? And so you get to, you have all these thoughts that sort of run through your head every day, right? But once you put them on paper, you have to organize them. We don't think in a linear way. We think in images a lot, and we think in sort of bursts of ideas and concepts. We don't think in full-blown sentences, and we don't think in paragraphs, right? And so we have to take all these ideas that are sort of swirling around in our head and put them down on paper. Unless you're Gertrude Stein, it doesn't work, right? You have to organize it, and you have to shape it up. Well, the good news is that you can make it look and sound and feel the way you want it to, because we have the ability to edit, which is great. But the problem is that means you really have to spend some time proofreading and having a sort of clear sense of what your task or what your mission is in terms of this writing. Right? So one thing that can help in terms of this is having a friendly reader. If there's someone you know that you trust that can read your paper and is not going to be judgmental, that's a good thing. It helps. And if you're writing to that person, well, maybe that's good too. It helps you, frees you up, and you know that someone is going to give you constructive criticism, and they're going to help you shape things up or help you to say what you mean. That's a good thing. You know, the other thing is if you're not good at grammar or punctuation or you have issues in that area, great. Find somebody that's a good editor that will edit your papers for you. That solves that problem right away. And the other thing to think about too is that you have a writing style. Everyone has a writing style. And so when people make mistakes in their writing, you refer to them as mistakes, but in a way they're not necessarily mistakes. They're purposeful. So if people are putting commas in the wrong place, or they're misusing a semicolon or an em dash, it's not an accident. They're doing it because they think it's right. So technically it might be wrong, but it's not usually because they're lazy writers or they just don't understand yet what the functionality of that level of punctuation is supposed to be, or why subject-verb agreement is important in this instance. A lot of times people can't see these things in their writing also. So that's why having an editor is super helpful. And after a while, you'll realize you're going to start to see that these things will start to repeat themselves, right? These patterns, which is part of your writing style. And once you see the patterns repeating itself, maybe then you can say, oh, this is a thing I do, and I should look out for this when I'm proofreading my papers. You can also find somebody to talk about your writing with, too. Certainly in terms of getting unstuck, if you have an idea or a concept about something you have to write about, and you're feeling stuck on it, well, having a conversation with somebody about that idea or concept can be incredibly illuminating. All sorts of ideas might start firing for you just by virtue of having a conversation and talking about it. You'll start to realize, I think, in these scenarios that you know a lot more about the topic than you think you do, or that someone brings up something that an angle that you hadn't considered, and all of a sudden it just opens doors for you. Well, that's great and incredibly helpful. My favorite strategy in terms of writer's block is the mind map. Some people call these things bubble maps or cluster maps. Mind maps are great. The basic idea in the mind map is that you have the big idea in the middle. So for this one, it's time management. And so you put down time management, and someone says, well, I want you to write me a 30-page paper on time management. Well, that seems like an impossible task. Right? And so if you create this mind map and start writing down ideas as they come to you, give yourself the time to think about it, process it, research, reading, whatever you need to do, right? And anytime you get an idea, you make some larger categories. So for instance, in this one, time management, we have the clarity category. We have monitoring progress, communication feedback, key issues, choices. There's a category for let go. There's one for supervise, delegation, effectiveness, mind tools, right? And so if you can come up with these larger categories, great. You say, oh, wow, okay, I got 8, 10 categories here. If you can come up with an idea for a category on time management, my suspicion is you could at the very least write a paragraph about clarity or about monitoring or about key issues. So once you get these larger categories out there, well then you start to think more deeply about, well, what am I looking at in terms of clarity and time management? What does that do as a category? Well, then you come up with motivation, appreciation, simplification, right? Well, all of a sudden you've got 3 more subcategories of clarity. My suspicion is that if you can come up with those 3 subcategories, you can write at least a paragraph on those ideas. You understand the concept in relationship to clarity, in relationship to time management. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? And so the more time and space you can give yourself to think about this concept of time management and fill in this mind map, the less likely it is you're going to be jammed up when it comes to the writing process. The other nice thing about mind maps is you can do whatever you want to them. However you want to make them unfold. This person did a lot of drawings. Great, if you want to do drawings on there, you want to color code it, however you want to do it. As long as it makes you want to look back at it again and keep thinking about it and keep digging in, great, do it. So the key then, we have some questions?
Well, we have 2.
Oh, I'll answer a question.
If you're okay. So,
Let's do it.
Rob, a question and a comment. A wise man once told me, do something even if it's wrong. Would this apply to writing?
Yes, 100% yes.
Next question.
Well, do something even if it's wrong? Is that what he said? Yeah?
Do something even if it's wrong. Would this apply to writing? Sounds
Yeah.
like the first draft
Well,
example.
yes. I mean, that's first drafting in a nutshell, right? It doesn't matter how you get that first draft out. Just get it out. There's going to be mistakes all over. There's going to be problems all over. Who cares? Get it out. Put it down for a day. Go back and look at it. Start to edit. Start to organize, right? Some people have a problem with their writing process being messy. So what? Who cares? You get to edit it. You get to change it. You get to shape it up. So that's a good question, actually. You got
Okay.
one?
And Kirk says, so what's the difference between writer's block / apprehension and a person just not being prepared? I would compare this to taking a test. If you're prepared, you do well. If you're not, you fail.
Well, I would say lack of preparation is a category or a symptom of writer's block. In the same way that apprehension could be considered a symptom, right? And so if you're not prepared, then you have a choice essentially to make. You can either become prepared or get prepared or not, right? And if you don't, well, you know that you're going to have problems. But if you are prepared, then at least you have given yourself the time and the space and the knowledge base to attack the writing task. So if you know that you're a person who procrastinates, then you can do something about that, right? Procrastination often has a negative connotation to it. And sometimes procrastination is just being lazy. But most of the time when people procrastinate, they do it because they're not ready to, in a writing context, it means that they're not ready to write yet. So even people that wait till the last minute to write, if you're not prepared and you do that, you're going to have problems. If you're reading and you're researching and you wait till the last minute to write, usually it means that you aren't ready to write until that last moment when you have to go. And some people can do that and do it well. That makes me nervous. I would rather write sections at a time and get to my deadline by doing that, as opposed to loading myself up and then just writing it all out in this sort of enormous burst of work. Some people can do it. Some people write that way. That's a good question. So back to the mind map. After you build your mind maps, you have to organize it. So we got all the categories, we got it all on paper, we got nice colors, nice drawings. Now we're going to take that information and figure out how we're going to organize it to meet the goals of our writing task. And the way to do that is to build an outline. So this is the second necessary step of the mind mapping. Take those categories, start to organize them on your paper, and think about what your big argument is in terms of time management, and how each of those categories are going to make an argument or a claim in terms of that time management argument that you're making, and organize it in a logical manner. Once you do that, now you have a roadmap of how you need to attack the task. It makes it a much easier prospect in terms of getting this writing done. If you can look at your outline and say, oh, I gotta write about this section, I gotta write about this section. Or if you know sections are coming up, it gives you more time to think about it. So by the time you get to that section, you're like, oh yeah, I thought about this and this and this, and now I'm ready to roll on that section because you knew it was coming. Okay, great. You can also plan it out time management-wise when you can get to each section of that writing assignment. Great. So organize it into an outline and then start writing. So this mind map that we looked at for time management, there were 100 clusters in that map. So if you can write a paragraph for each one of those clusters, how many pages of writing do you think that is? Let's just say that, well, if we say that conservatively, in a double-spaced paper, you're going to get 3 paragraphs per page. Math people, that's 30 pages. Just on that cluster map, that mind map alone, you have the potential, if you can write a paragraph about each one of those topics related to time management, you got a 30-page paper. All of a sudden, that 30-page paper seems very doable. Whereas if you looked at this task, and if I said to you, I want you, your final assignment is to write a 30-page paper on time management, go. And all you could think about it is in this sort of, this monolithic thing that you have to do. It's going to be debilitating. But now, since we've bothered to mind map it and start to like sort this thing out, well, now we've broken it into very manageable pieces. So you write to each piece, and then arrange it. And all of a sudden it doesn't seem so daunting anymore. So other strategies, talking with other people about your writing, I think is an excellent thing to do, especially academic work. If you can talk to people in your class or peers, or form these little writing groups where you read each other's papers, it's great. You can also, what's interesting too about, certainly in classwork, that there's always somebody in class that knows something that you don't know. And you are that person to others as well. And so when you create these writing groups or work groups or study groups, you realize as a group, you're much smarter as a group, that everyone has something to contribute, that someone else remembered something in class or it made sense to them in a way that didn't make sense to you. Great. Sit around and talk about it, all of a sudden it starts making sense to everybody, and you become a much more functional student because you bothered to make a writing group. Free writing is a great way to get unstuck too. That's part of the reason why we did that process. I want you to start to think about how just a one-word prompt with no expectations attached to it frees you up to get writing. Well, you can give yourself one-word prompts. You write them down on a card, and if you're feeling stuck, flip over a card and start writing. You don't know what's coming when you do that. Or pick a word out of a book, right? And whatever you come up with, start writing. Free writing's great. It primes the pump. Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird is, I think, an excellent book in terms of writing strategies. It's an easy to read. It's easy to read. It's excellent. I think she's got some great ideas. And her section in there on shitty first drafts is great. And by the time you're done with that, you feel a lot freer as a writer. And whatever is sort of constricting you in terms of your ability to write freely really starts to fall away. When people make writing plans and then their plan doesn't work out, well, great, change your plan. If it's not working, do something different. But I think people are very hung up on these sort of mythological ideas about writing and that it's magical in some way, or that it is bequeathed to you in some way, that either you're a writer or you're not. It's a practice, right? And you have a lot of control over how you attack your writing processes. One thing you think about too, if you're stuck too, is maybe it's a domain knowledge issue, right? That maybe you just don't know enough about the subject or the topic yet. So if you're feeling stuck that way, well, great, back it up a little bit, do some more research. Once you feel like you've got adequate levels of domain knowledge, then one of the things that I think that people sort of forget to do, or they think is wrong in some way, is to pair that domain knowledge, that new knowledge, with your prior knowledge. My suspicion is that if you've been operating in the world for 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years, you know a lot. You know how the world works. And the way we make new knowledge is taking abstract concepts and connecting that to concrete knowledge that we already have. If we can't do that, the abstract will always remain abstract. It will remain in your short-term memory. It's how we get things from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. We take abstract concepts and we connect it to concrete knowledge. How is this thing like something I already know? Great. Once you make that connection, you don't forget it. And so I think that's a good strategy. Don't discount what you already know about the world. Bring that into your work. Sometimes it's a task environment issue. You know, it could be a work-related, audience expectation-related problem that's jamming you up. If you can identify that, and you can do something about it. That's it on the slides. Let's go to some questions. What kind of questions?
Well, Olivia has a really excellent question, especially for an academic environment. How do you keep from copying a work that inspires you? How do you maintain originality?
There is absolutely no way for you to copy that work unless you rewrote it word for word. Now, you can work off of other people's ideas, which is completely legitimate, as long as you credit that person for that idea or concept. This this is what we do in academia. What we're trying to do is take all the prior knowledge on a subject or a topic, right? Everything that's known about it, and use that information and build on it. So what we're trying to do is to spiral upwards in terms of this idea or concept. If you look at someone else's work and you say, oh, this is it, this is the be-all, end-all of this idea or subject, what you're saying is that text or that work is fixed. That all the knowledge about that idea is in this one work, which is not true and not possible. Especially if we're operating under the assumption that the reader makes the meaning. So whatever it is that you're reading, there is not knowledge. Like we took a book and we said, that book is full of knowledge. Well, there's only knowledge in that book if you, as the reader, perceive it to be knowledge, right? And that it's not fixed, and that if 40 people read this same book, they're going to think about it in 40 different ways, mostly related to their subject position in the world, like, or their worldview, or how they see the world, or their prior experience. No two people are going to read that book in the same way. So it tells you that knowledge isn't fixed. It's fluid. It changes every time someone interacts with it. That's why we use other people's work in academia to try and keep building on the concept. Did I answer that question?
Apply that to writers of fiction. That same question to writers of fiction.
Well, what's the question in terms of fiction? Or what's the issue?
Maintaining originality?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that fiction is great because it allows you to do everything that's not possible in the world, number one, right? And that many people believe that fiction is more real than real life, because what you're often taking, you take away ideas from fiction, but often what you take away is how you feel about that idea or concept or that character or what they're doing. And I don't think you can replicate other people's work. I think you can build on other people's work, but I think it's impossible to replicate other people's work unless you're taking that idea, you're taking an original idea that someone had and posing it as your own idea. Well, that's a different story. But I think it's incredibly difficult to do these days. One of the things they said about Shakespeare, one of the ways in which he created a lot of his stories was that he took stories that he thought were inadequate and, in his estimation, took them to their logical ends. He thought about all the levels of this character or the story that the original author hadn't considered. And so they can pin a lot of these stories back to other stories that people wrote or told, but he takes it to such a degree that it becomes mind-boggling in a lot of ways, and much more rich and much more deep than the original author ever considered. There was also no rules in those days about plagiarism, or there was no such thing as intellectual property rights, and so I don't think anyone really considered this to be problematic in any way. And Harold Bloom, credits Shakespeare with inventing the personality. I mean, it's a pretty big statement, but it also speaks to the level in which he sort of was willing to go in terms of elucidating the human condition in terms of these stories, right? I don't think that you could replicate what Shakespeare did. You could build on it, but I don't think you could actually replicate it. There's nothing in it. It's empty calories if you're doing it anyway, right? You're not changing the world in any way, shape, or form. And I don't know what anyone would hope to accomplish in terms of doing something like that. But you're not doing anything for the world. You're trying to do something like that. So.
There was another question that was further up towards the top.
Good luck. Okay, so it looks like a writing question. I'm working on a second draft of a document that has now moved to a team review setting. When other eyes are watching, it's both motivating but also intimidating because I want it to be the best I can. Are there any mental tools to block that out if my mind in the moments at my keyboard while not losing the motivation and the fact that people are supporting me?
That's tough. This speaks to your relationship, your personal relationship with your writing, more than it is about other people judging your work. I think in most instances, the people reading your work want it to be great. They want you to be great. They want the reading, or the writing to be meaningful and effective in some way, shape, or form. And so sometimes, and especially if you think you're doing a pretty good job, and then you get criticism, whether it's constructive or not, it can be very difficult to take on. And I think you have to build some sort, I guess what you have to do is you have to not let your feelings about your writing become more important than the problem. And the problem is getting the task done and getting it accomplished. And so, especially in these group settings where other people are going to comment or even participate on your work, collaborative writing is very difficult. It's very tough for people to submit to a collaborative writing process. But if you can do it, and your group is high functioning, it can be incredible. It can sort of take your writing places where you might not have imagined it. But that is a function of the personality of the group and the willingness of the group in terms of creating constructive ways to talk about other people's writing. So much of it depends on the context of the writing event and who's reading it and what's at stake, And so, yes, sometimes you feel like you have to protect yourself in some way, shape, or form. But also, the more you can sort of think your way through the process and separate your feelings about the writing from the task or the problem, the better off you're going to be.
While you're sitting at that keyboard, continuing to write.
Yeah, it's hard, but you have to separate your feelings out of the equation and just think about it in a logical, constructive way. You can have feelings about it when you're done, but when you're in the middle of the process, it can be problematic. And so, I don't know. That's a tough one, but you have to figure out a logical way through it. Did you answer that?
I think so.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Not right now.
Okay. Thank you, everybody who came out tonight to listen to our talk and participate, and thank you to the librarians for setting this all up. We're the best librarians. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to talk to you about your writing or anything you're concerned about. And yeah, start writing. Come on.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Florian. Appreciate it.